Chapter 12 of Inspector French's Greatest Case by Freeman, Wills, Crofts. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganand. Inspector French's Greatest Case, Chapter 12, The Elusive Mrs. X. Inspector French put up at a small hotel near the town station and next morning was early at the White Star offices. There he learned that the Olympic was even at the moment coming in, and he went down to the quays and watched the berthing of the monster vessel. It was an impressive experience to see her creep up to a place, maneuver into position, and make fast. Then from her gangways began to stream the travellers who, for the better part of a week, had journeyed aboard her. Some were hurrying, already intent on business, or anxious to catch trains, others leisurely awaiting taxis and motor cars, some smilingly greeting friends or waving farewells to voyage acquaintances, all drifting gradually away, their places taken by others and still others. French began to think the exodus would never cease, but at last the crowd diminished and he pushed his way on board and began a search for the purser. Urgent work in connection with the arrival prevented that busy official from attending to him at once, but he sent a steward to show French to his cabin and presently joined him there. "Sorry for keeping you waiting, Inspector," he apologized. "You want some information about our home trip late November?" "Yes," French answered, and he explained his business and produced Mrs. Root's marked photographs, concluding, "I want to find out the names and addresses of these 8 women and as much information as possible about them." "I'm afraid I could scarcely give you that," the purser answered. "The records of each trip go ashore at the end of the trip, and I've only those of this present one. But some of the staff might remember the names of the ladies, and if so, you could get their addresses at the office ashore." "That would do excellently. I have a copy of the passenger list here, if it would be of any use." "Yes, it would be a reminder. Let me see now if I can help you myself, and if not, I think I can put you in the way of getting to know." He began to scrutinize the photographs. "That's Mrs. Root," French indicated, moving around and looking over the other's shoulder. "She gave me the names of 5, but I should like to check her recollection. The other 3 she couldn't remember." The purser nodded as he turned the pictures over. "That's Mrs. Forbes," he pointed, "and I rather think that is a Miss Grayson or Graves or some name like that. I remember most of these other faces, but not the people's names." "Mrs. Forbes and Miss Grayson are correct according to Mrs. Root." The purser laid down the photographs with an air of quiet decision which seemed characteristic. "I'm afraid that's my limit." He touched a bell. "Ask Mrs. Hope to come in here," he ordered, continuing to French. "Mrs. Hope is chief stewardess. You can go round with her, and I expect she'll get you what you want all right." Mrs. Hope was an efficient-looking woman who quickly grasped what was required of her. She asked French to accompany her to her sanctum, and there looked over the photographs. She was herself able to identify 6 of the portraits, and on calling on some of her underlings, the names of the remaining 2 were speedily forthcoming. French was glad to find that Mrs. Root's recollection of the names of her fellow travellers had been correct as far as it had gone, and as he left the great vessel, he devoutly hoped that she might have been correct also in her belief that Mrs. X was among the 8 women she had indicated. If so, he was well on his way to identify that elusive lady. He returned to the White Star office and explained that he wanted to know the Christian names, addresses, and other available particulars of the 8 women whose names were marked on the passenger list, which he handed in, as well as to see a specimen of the handwriting of each. He realized that the only conclusive test was the handwriting. If one of the 8 women wrote the hand of Mrs. X checks, he had reached his goal. If not, he determined to go through the declarations of every woman who had crossed on the trip in question in the hope of finding what he sought. The clerk, who had been instructed to attend to him, brought out a mass of papers. "I wonder," he said apologetically, "if you would mind looking through these yourselves? It's our busy day, and I have an awful lot to get through. You see, it's quite simple. These are the embarkations declaration for the trip, and you can turn to any one you want quite easily. They are arranged in alphabetical order in the different classes. They'll give you what you want to know straight off." "Right you are," French declared, delighted thus to get a free hand. "Don't you bother about me. I'll peg away and come and ask you if I get into trouble." He picked away, looking up the declaration of each of the 8 women, noting the name, address, nationality, and other particulars, and then comparing the handwriting with the signatures on the Mrs. X checks. He was not a handwriting expert, but he knew enough about the signs to recognize the characteristics which remain unchanged when the writing is disguised. He was therefore very patient and thorough in his search, never passing a signature because it looked unlike the model at first sight, but testing each by the rules he had learned and satisfying himself that it really had been written by a different hand. He went on without incident until he reached the 8th name on the list. But when he turned to the declaration of Mrs. Ward, the lady whom Mrs. Root had thought the most likely of the lot, he gave a sudden little chuckle of delight. There was the hand of the checks, the same hand unquestionably, and written without any attempt at disguise. There it was, Mrs. Elizabeth Ward, aged 39, British subject, etc., etc., of Oaklands, Thirsk Road, York. He had reached his goal. But immediately he was assailed by misgivings. Mrs. Root had thought of Mrs. Ward, but had ruled her out because of her nationality. Mrs. Ward, she had said, was English, while all the people who had seen Mrs. X, 17 or 18 persons at least, had agreed she was an American. He would have assumed that Mrs. Root had made a mistake, but for the fact that the declaration said English also. French was puzzled, and he decided that he would go back to the ship and ascertain the views of the staff on the point. But they all supported Mrs. Root. Mrs. Ward was English, undoubtedly and unquestionably English. The stewards and the stewardesses had some experience on the point, and they guessed they knew. Also, he came across the doctor, who, it appeared, had spoken on several occasions to Mrs. Ward, and he was equally positive. It chanced that as he was leaving the ship, he encountered the woman to whom Mrs. Root had advised him to apply, the striking-looking stewardess with the dark eyes and white hair, and he stopped and spoke to her. Unfortunately, she could not tell him very much. She remembered Mrs. Ward both by name and appearance, though she had not attended to her. But it chanced, nevertheless, her attention had been specially directed to her because of a certain incident which had taken place towards the end of the voyage. Passing down the corridor while lunch was being served, she had seen the door of one of the cabins in her own charge open slightly, and a lady appear and glance quickly round as if to see if she was unobserved. The cabin was occupied by Mrs. Root, an American, but the lady was this Mrs. Ward. Something stealthy and furtive in her appearance had excited the stewardess's suspicion, and she had drawn back into another cabin to await developments. Mrs. Ward, evidently satisfied that she was unnoticed, had turned to the dining saloon and taken a place. The stewardess had kept her eye on her, and after the meal she had seen her go up to Mrs. Root and speak to her, as if reporting the result of her mission. This action had lulled the stewardess's suspicion, but she had returned to Mrs. Root's cabin and had had a look round to see if anything had been disturbed. So far as she could see, nothing had, nor had Mrs. Root made any complaint about the things having been interfered with. If further confirmation of his suspicions were needed, French felt that this episode supplied it. Doubtless Mrs. Ward was amassing information as to the other's clothes and belongings to assist her in her impersonation. Perhaps also she was photographing envelopes or other documents of which to prepare forgeries in case of need. There still remained the difficulty of her nationality. Obviously, it is easy to mimic the accent and manner of a foreigner, but French found it hard to believe that such mimicry could be so perfect as to deceive a large number of persons, many of whom were experts on that particular point. This, however, was only a part of the general problem and did not affect his next business, to find Mrs. Elizabeth Ward, Thirsk Road, York. He went ashore and, turning into a telegraph office, sent a wire to the chief of police of York, asking him if a lady of that name lived at the address in question, and if so, to wire was she at home. His next business was at police headquarters, and thither he was directing his steps when a thought struck him, and he turned aside to the sheds in which the transatlantic luggage is examined. Several of the customs officers were still there, and he went up and spoke to one of them. "Now," the young fellow answered in surprise, "it's a darn queer thing that you came to me about that. Quite a coincidence, that is. I know a man who went through those trunks. He told me about it at the time. It seemed a darn silly thing that anyone should want to bring trunks of blankets from America. If you come along, I'll find him for you. And so the lady's wanted, is she? Say, Jack, he called a colleague, another clean, efficient young fellow of the same type. Here someone wants you. He wants to know about those trunks of blankets you were telling me about 2 or 3 trips of Olympic back. A darned queer coincidence that he should come to me about them. That's what I call it. Yes, you have made a lucky shot, haven't you? The second man said to French. I remember the trunks and the lady they belonged to, because I couldn't understand why anyone should want to bring trunks of blankets across the Atlantic. I've never known anyone do it before. You didn't make any remarks about them? French asked. No, but she did. She said she reckoned I hadn't often seen trunks of blankets brought over from America. You see, I was a bit suspicious at first and was examining the things pretty carefully. I said that was so, and she said she was taking back a small but valuable collection of porcelain ornaments which she would pack in the blankets, and that when she had to bring trunks anyway, she thought she might as well bring the packing as well, and so save buying new. I thought the whole business a bit off, but there was nothing dutiable in the case, and it wasn't my job to interfere. Is there anything wrong about it? I don't know, French told him. I think the woman was a crook, but I'm not on to the blanket stunt yet. By the way, is she in one of those groups? The young man identified Mrs. Ward without hesitation, and French, finding he had learned all that the customs man could tell him, resumed his way to the police station. He wondered what this blanket business really did mean. Then, as he walked slowly along with head bent forward and eyes vacantly scanning the pavement, a possible explanation occurred to him. These trunks, apparently, were required solely as properties to assist in the fraud. Mrs. Root, the wife of Pittsburgh magnate, would scarcely arrive at the Savoy from America without American trunks. But when Mrs. Root came to disappear, the trunks would become an embarrassment. They would have to get rid of it, and as a matter of fact, they were got rid of. They must therefore contain nothing of the lady's no personal possession which might act as a clue to its owner. But they must contain something. Empty trunks would be too light and might be observed by the chambermaid, and comments might be occasioned among the hotel staff which might reach the management and which would become important if Mr. Williams rang up to make his inquiries. But blankets would exactly fill the bill. Indeed, French could think of nothing more suitable for the purpose. They would give the trunks a moderate weight, they would not supply a clue to Mrs. Ward, and they would be cheap, while their presence could be accounted for sufficiently reasonably to the customs officers. Yes, French thought, it was probable enough explanation. Arrived at the police station, he sent in his name with a request to see the officer in charge. Superintendent Hayes had been stationed in London before he got his present appointment, and had come across French on more than one occasion. He therefore greeted the inspector cordially, found him a comfortable chair, and supplied him with an excellent cigar. From Trinidad, he explained. I get them direct from a man I know out there. And what's the best news of you? They discussed old times for some minutes. Then French turned to the business in hand. It's an interesting case, he said, as he gave the other the details, continuing, the woman must be a pretty cool hand. She could easily invent that tale about losing a passport for old William's edification, but under the circumstances, her coming to you about it was a bit class. She had a nerve, yes, superintendent admitted. But you see, it was necessary. She must have known that the absence of the passport would strike Williams as suspicious, and it was necessary for her to remove that suspicion. She couldn't very well get a bag of that kind stolen without informing the police, so she had to inform them. She would see how easily Williams could check her statement, as indeed he did. No, I don't see how she could have avoided coming to us. It was an obvious precaution. I quite agree with all you say, French returned. But it argues a cool customer for all that, not only, so to speak, putting a head into the lion's mouth, but at the same time calling his attention to its being there. Anyway, I've got to find her, and I wish you would let me have details about her. I've got some from the Olympic people, but I want to pick up everything I can. The superintendent telephoned to someone to send up Sergeant McCarthy, and when a tall, cadaverous man entered, He introduced him as the man who had dealt with the business in question. Sergeant McCarthy has just been transferred to us from Liverpool, he explained. Sit down, McCarthy. Inspector French wants to know some details about the woman who lost her handbag coming off the Olympic some 7 weeks ago. I think you handled the thing. Do you remember Mrs. Root of Pittsburgh? I mind her rightly, sir, the man answered in what French believed was a Belfast accent. But it wasn't coming off the Olympic she lost it. It was later on the same day, though it was on the quays right enough. Tell us all you can about it. The sergeant pulled out his notebook. I have it in me other book, he announced. If you'll excuse me, I'll get it. In a moment he returned, sat down, and turning over the dog's-eared pages of a well-worn book, began as if reciting evidence in court. On the 24th November last at about 3 p.m., I was passing through the crowd on the outer quays when I heard a woman cry out, "Thief! Thief!" she shouted, and she ran up and caught me by the arm. She was middling tall and thinnish, her face pale and her hair dark. She spoke in an American voice and seemed upset or excited. She said to me, breathless like, "Say, officer," she said, "I've just had my dispatch case stolen." I asked her where and how and what was in it. She said right there where we were standing, and not 3 seconds before. She was carrying it in her hand, and it was snatched out of it. She turned round and saw a man juke away in the crowd. She shouted and made after him, but he was away before she could get near. I asked her what the case was like, and she said a small, square, brown morocco leather one with gold fittings. I went and told the 2 men on duty close by, and we kept a watch on the exits, but we never saw a sign of it. Sergeant McCarthy shook his head gloomily as he concluded, "She hadn't any call to be carrying a gold-fitted case in that crowd anyway." "That's a fact, Sergeant," the superintendent agreed. "And you never came on any trace of it?" "No, sir. I brought her up to the station and took her name and all particulars. There's the report." He unfolded a paper and laid it on the superintendent's desk. In the document was a detailed description of the lady, of the alleged dispatch case and its contents, and of the means that had been taken to try and trace it. The pawnbrokers had been advised, and a special watch kept on fences and other usual channels for the disposal of stolen goods. When French had digested these particulars, he brought out once more his photographs and handed them to the sergeant. "Look at those, Sergeant, and tell me if you see the woman among them." Slowly the sergeant turned them over, gazing at them in precisely the same puzzled way as had done Mr. Williams, Mr. Scarlett, and the other London men to whom they had been shown. And with the same doubt and hesitation he presently fixed on Mrs. Ward. "That would be to be her," he declared slowly. "That is, if she is there at all. It isn't a good likeness, but I believe it's her all the same." "You wouldn't swear to her?" "I'd hardly, but I believe it's her for all that." French nodded, the sergeant's statement, agreeing as it did with those of Messrs. Williams, Scarlett and Co., seemed capable of but one explanation. Mrs. X was Mrs. Ward all right, but before meeting these men she had made herself up to impersonate Mrs. Root. They saw a likeness to Mrs. Ward because it really was she, but they were doubtful because she was disguised. The inspector leaned forward and tapped the photograph. "Put it this way, Sergeant," he suggested. "Here is a picture of the lady as she really is. When you saw her, she was made up to look like another woman. How's that, do you think?" In Sergeant McCarthy's lackluster eyes there shone a sudden gleam. "That's just what it is, sir," he answered with an approach to something almost like interest in his manner. "That's it, and no mistake. She's like the photograph of her features, but not by her makeup." He nodded his head several times in appreciation. "Very good." Inspector French invariably liked as many strings to his bow as he could get. "Now, I want some hint from you that will help me trace her." But this was just what Sergeant McCarthy could not supply. The woman had given 2 addresses, the Savoy in London and Mrs. Root's home in Pittsburgh. There was no help in either, and no other information was forthcoming. He lunched with his friend the superintendent, afterwards withdrawing to the lounge of his hotel to have a quiet smoke and to think things over. While he sat there, a page appeared with a telegram. It was a reply from the police at York, and read, "Your wire. no one of that name or address known. French swore disgustedly. He had, of course, realized that the name might be false, but yet he had hoped against hope that he might really have reached the end of at least this portion of his quest. But here he was as far from the truth as ever. He would now have to make a fresh start to trace this elusive lady. He used another adjective in his mind, and he couldn't see that he was any better equipped for the search now than he had started out from Mr. Williams' office. It was a confoundedly exasperating case, just bristling with promising clues which one after another petered out as he came to follow them up. Being on it was like trying to cross a stream on stepping stones which invariably gave way when he came to place his weight on them. It was an annoying thought also that would scarcely be the view his chief would take of the matter. The chief had not been over-complimentary already in his comments on his handling of the case, and French felt that he would view this new check in anything but a sympathetic spirit. However, grousing about it wouldn't lead anywhere, and with an effort he switched his thoughts back to his problem. As he thought it over, a further point occurred to him. Since his first visit to the Savoy, he had wondered why the lady had turned up there so much later than the other passengers from the Olympic, and now he saw the reason. The episode of the handbag had taken place some 4 hours after the vessel's arrival, long after the special boat train had left. Mrs. X, for she was still Mrs. X, must therefore have travelled up by an afternoon train, probably the 5:26 or 6:22 p.m. from West Station, which got in 6:58 and 8:20 respectively. Now, why this delay? What had she done during these 4 hours? The answer was not far to seek. Was it not to give her time and opportunity to assume a disguise? He felt it must be so. The lady was her natural self, other than in name, on board the Olympic, and having no opportunity to alter her appearance, she had passed through the customs in the same character. Hence, the ship's staff and the customs officer had instantly recognized her photograph. But it was obvious that her impersonation of Mrs. Root must begin before she interviewed the Southampton police, and that accounted for the hesitation of Sergeant McAfee and the people in London in identifying her. She had therefore made herself up between passing through the customs at, say, 11 o'clock and calling on the sergeant at 3. Where was she during those 4 hours? She put himself in a place. Confronted with a problem, what would he have done? Gone to a hotel, unquestionably. Taken a room in which to assume the disguise. Had Mrs. X engaged a bedroom in one of the Southampton hotels for that afternoon? As he thought over the thing, further probabilities occurred to him. The lady would go up to a bedroom as one person and come down as another. Therefore, surely the larger the hotel, the less chance of the transformation being observed. One of a crowd, she would go to the reception office and engage a room for a few hours' rest and pay for it then and there. Then, having accomplished the make-up, she would slip out unobserved in the stream of passers-by. Yes, French felt sure he was on the right track, and with a fresh accession of energy, he jumped to his feet, knocked out his pipe, and left the building. He called first at the Southwestern and made his inquiries, but there he drew blank. At the Dolphin he had no better luck, but at the Polygon he found what he wanted. After examining the records, the reception clerk there was able to recall the transaction. About midday, an American lady had come in, and saying she wanted a few hours' rest before catching the 5:26 to London, had engaged a bedroom on a quiet floor until that hour. She had registered, and French, on looking up the book, was delighted to find once more the handwriting of the lady of the checks. It was true that on this occasion she figured as Mrs. Silas R. Clam of Hill Drive, Boston, Massachusetts. But knowing what he knew of her habits, French would have been surprised to have found a name he had seen before. At first he was delighted at so striking a confirmation of his theory, but as he pursued his inquiries, his satisfaction vanished, and once more depression and exasperation swept over him. For the reception clerk could not remember anything more than the mere fact of the letting of the room, and no one else in the building remembered the woman at all. With his usual pertinacity, he questioned all who might have come in contact with her, but from none of them did he receive the slightest help. That Mrs. X had made herself up at the hotel for her impersonation stunt was clear, but unfortunately it was equally clear that she had vanished from the building without leaving any trace. The worst of the whole business was that he didn't see what more he could do. The special clues upon which he had been building had failed him, and he felt there was now nothing for it but to fall back on the general one of the photographs. One of the portraits was excellently clear as to details, and he decided he would have an enlargement made of Mrs. X and circulate it among the police in the hope that some member at some time might recognize the lady. Not a very hopeful method certainly, but all he had left. He took an evening train from the West Station, and a couple of hours afterwards reached his home, a thoroughly tired and disgruntled man. The end of chapter 12.